Dr. Michael Stone, who is a research fellow here with us in Manchester. Dr. Stone's background is in electrical engineering, and for many years he worked with Professor Brian Moore in Cambridge. He's going to talk to us today about the subclinical effect of noise exposure.
Okay. So hopefully this isn't going to feel like it's teaching you to suck eggs, because I mean everyone knows that noise does damage to you, and so there's been a lot of industrial regulation coming over the past 40 years, certainly in the UK, to try and limit the person's exposure to it. But what I want to report today is perhaps a new form of hearing loss that hasn't been previously recognised. And this the data we gathered in Cambridge over the past couple of years using third-year project students. And then we've had to be tidied up a bit because, as you may appreciate, project data isn't always the best quality. But it was tidied up, and it looks really quite a coherent story, though. So, yeah, let's get on to the first one. So let's do a bit of a revision about what we're talking about. I mean, hopefully most of you should know what a hair cell is, and we're going to be talking quite a bit about hair cells. And basically, in a standard cochlea, you have sort of a row of 3 outer hair cells and a row of inner hair cells. Although actually, this is just the top of the hair cell. These are the stereocilia that are projecting through the plate of the organ of Corti here. And the cell body is actually beneath the stereocilia. So a sort of cartoon that I've done here shows sort of a long, thin body with a few tufts on the top, a bit like some of your elderly male lecturers around here. Okay, so they sort of, in animal type photographs, you always see this beautiful 3 rows, very neatly ordered for the outer hair cells, and 1 row of inner hair cells, which look similarly neatly ordered. But actually, when you ask the physiologists, they say, well, we only give you the best pictures. So you have to sort of take that as being sort of, that's stylized as to what you should expect to see. And perhaps there's evidence that that isn't what really happens in a lot of, say, humans. So let's look a bit more closely at the inner hair, the hair cells, and what exactly do they do. And actually, compared to the previous slide, what I've done, this cartoon of the hair cell here, I've actually turned it round to show you where the stereocilia are, these little hairs are, relative to the body of the cell. So in this next picture, because I've turned this hair cell round because the picture is actually the other way around. So let's look at a sort of a cartoon as to sort of where these hair cells actually exist. So if you chop straight through the cochlea, through the cochlear spiral, you've got the basilar membrane running across from one bony wall to another. You've got the tectorial membrane sitting on top of it, and then in this sort of the organ of Corti, you've got 1 row of inner hair cells and a row of outer hair cells, which are sitting there being pushed by the vibration that you get as the basilar membrane goes up and down. And if you sort of simplify this as to really how we understand what these different cells are doing, it's really sort of like this, where you have sort of 3 Charles Atlas outer hair cells which are pushing, altering the distance between the basilar membrane and the tectorial membrane to actually provide active amplification, to actually give you the exquisite sensitivity that you see in a healthy cochlea. And essentially the inner hair cells, because they're responding to the vibration, they're sending neural impulses to the brain for further processing. So they sort of act like a microphone. So what this talk is talking about the different effects you're going to get when you have damage to either the outer hair cells or the inner hair cells. And just from this sort of straightforward schematic, you can see that if you blat the inner hair cell here, you've got no electrical connection between the basilar membrane and the brain, then no matter how good the outer hair cells are, if you've lost that, you're in trouble. So this is part of an underlying theme of this talk, is just how much in trouble are we from the things that we've identified. And ultimately, in the extreme case, when you've lost all your inner hair cells, or a substantial proportion of them, then you go for a cochlear implant rather than a hearing aid, because a hearing aid is totally useless. The hearing aid is just vibrating the basilar membrane. And the only way to get a direct link to the brain is electrical, so you have to put an implant, an electrode array in. So, if we go back quite a long time to 1984, Charlie Liebman in Liebman, Dodds, and there's Liebman and Kian, they did a series of about 4 papers in hearing research, absolutely fantastic papers, looking at noise damage in cats. Now what they were looking at was actually looking at the effect, there was sort of sectioning cochlea after these cats had been exposed to noise, and what they were looking for was visible physical damage to the hair cells. Now you always have to remember this sort of animal data type work is that it's really in extremis, that they do things like put in narrowband noises, which isn't the sort of noise that we get exposed to. We get exposed to sort of broadband noises. They do it for very short times. They don't allow the animal any chance to recovery, and they just black the animal, and then they sort of do nasty things to chop up their cochlea afterwards. So you tend to get a very homogeneous result out of the cochlea of these sorts of animals, but A, they're in a different animal compared to humans, and B, the noise exposure profile is actually very different from what you might get in a human. So whenever you see the animal data, you always have to sort of have a sort of squinty eye at it and go, well, okay, how would this translate into humans, and do we see it in humans? So the sort of summary of these papers is saying that when you put noise-exposed animals, you see physical damage to the outer hair cells primarily. That's what you see. But then, as you increase the sound level up to sort of really quite high levels, the visible site of damage moves from the outer hair cells to involving the inner hair cells. And finally, what they found was that it was hard just to damage the inner hair cells without some involvement of outer hair cell damage. So you have this problem when you're trying to measure something out of the animal at the end, the sort of the hearing loss you're seeing is a composite of both inner hair cell loss and outer hair cell loss. So again, that does sort of slightly confound the results. So there are various causes that we know in humans that cause inner hair cell-like decline. And now that we've moved away from animals towards humans, whenever I say inner hair cell, I think you have to be careful. And I've got into a lot of trouble in the past when I say inner hair cell, because it's a human. We don't know currently what the exact site of lesion is because we haven't chopped them open, and it's a bit unethical to do that. So we just have to rely on the fact and the psychophysics of what the response comes out at the end of the finger, and it's gone in at the ear. So it's gone a long path all the way down to the end of the finger. So there's all sorts of potential places where other things can be added which mess up the data slightly. But if we go back to some data from Otter et al. 1978, what he did was take human cochlea from obviously dead people and section them and do counts of what the spiral ganglion cells. Now these are the first set of cells that the inner hair cells contact with after they leave the basilar membrane. So they're a really important count of how much neural connection is there from right next to the basilar membrane heading up to the brain. And what you see, and so they've actually got numbers underneath it in brackets, if you can just see there's a sort of number of temporal bones in sections. So as a function of age, at the bottom, a decade of age, 1 to 10, 11 to 20, he doesn't actually have very many, thankfully, for children and infant type temporal bones. But he does have quite a few older temporal bones up here in sort of the sort of 60s to 80s, which is where you expect a lot more to become available. And what he basically shows is that as a function of age, there seems to be a natural decline of the spiral ganglion cells. There's a natural decrease in the number of neural connections to the brain. Now that's with age. There could be other confounds such as diet or noise exposure. So a more recent set of cochlear temporal bones has been prepared by a chap called Macquarie. It's again in the Lieberman lab in America. And they've produced an equation for sort of showing the decline. And I've actually plotted it on here in this dashed turquoise line to show that actually it's pretty similar, the rate of decline with age. And the Macquarie data, they've tried to use cochlea which are really clean, where there's no visible sign of damage to outer or inner hair cells, so that it then likely to be low noise exposed. And so what you see is there's possibly a slightly slower decline with age, and the other differential decline is probably due to something like age or maybe poorer diet. But it's not bad that actually they're showing something pretty similar, nothing really drastic between the two. So age is one source of decline of inner hair cell type connections. Another one is sort of trauma, noise trauma as we might expect, or ototoxicity. That is, if there are sort of drugs that you might take, and things like the antibiotics in the mycin family are recognised for doing that, where they can actually knock out hair cells. They tend to clog up the stereocilia. But there are other things such as organic solvents and sort of virtually anything you like in the excess seems to sort of be not terribly good. Anything that sort of reduces oxygen flow to the cochlea as well seems to cause problems. And finally, our favourite is sort of noise. So this is the audiogram of a man who was taken shortly before he died. So you've got an idea of the sensitivity of his hearing. So here you've got the hearing loss in dB going from normal at the top here down to about 80 dB. And what you see as a function of frequency, what you see, this guy has a sort of quite a steeply sloping high frequency hearing loss, attributed to the fact that he was 60 years old and he'd worked in high intensity noise environment in a rolling mill, a steel rolling mill, for many years. And then what they did was they sectioned his cochlea for about the first 1 1/4 turns, and counted the sort of the outer hair cells. And so down here is the sort of the lower frequency end of the cochlear, and here's the higher frequency end. 100% is at the top, 0 at the bottom. So gradually you see that there's a bit of damage to the outer hair cells, but as you get up right up to the top end, they're really getting quite bashed around. But the other thing that's really quite interesting in this is they do a count here of the inner hair cells, stereocilia. Not the top line is the outer hair cells. The bottom line, bottom graph, is actually the inner hair cells stereocilia. And they've done two different measures. One is the sort of how much do you see some damage to the stereocilia sitting on top of the inner hair cell, and how much do you see them absolutely trashed. And what you see is actually that some of them, in some parts of the cochlea, at certain frequencies, they are really quite trashed, but generally you do see a similar, also slight trashing all the way across the range of frequency. But there's certain bits where they're really quite badly damaged. So you've got stereocilia which are damaged, rotated, but they're still sort of vaguely there as opposed to being missing. So perhaps there is some transduction through them, but it may be quite distorted. And I think we need to bear that in mind in some of the stuff I'm going to show you shortly. And we do know that when if you do sort of gunshots, such as assault rifles, it can take as few as about half a dozen shots to actually to really trash some of the stereocilia, and actually you end up with what we call dead regions where there's no functional transduction. So really high sound levels really do cause quite a lot of damage to the stereocilia. But we don't quite know what happens to sort of slightly lower sound levels, the ones which we're more commonly exposed to. And another concept I want to introduce is, has been around in the literature for some time, which is this thing called a critical level for noise damage. Because industrial exposure regulations say that if you expose somebody to a certain amount of noise, that they're making the assumption that equal energy equals equal damage to the cochlea. So if you could be in a sort of moderately noisy environment, you could tolerate it for 8 hours. If you bump up the sound level by 3 dB, that's twice the power. 3 dB is equivalent to doubling the power. Then you actually have to half the amount of time that you can expose them to that noise before they've got to the same energy. So there's a sort of trade-off that as you increase the sound level, you have to reduce the exposure time. Now, I mean, anything that you deal with, I mean, like if you take a ruler and you spring it, you're quite used to the idea that it's actually linear over a range of bounces. So if you just sort of do a gentle tap on it, it will bounce slightly. If you do a bigger tap, it will bounce and give you a bit more noise. But then there's some point where you whack it too hard and it breaks. Okay, so we know that the equal energy hypothesis must break down somewhere, but the question is where. It's also recognised that equal energy hypothesis doesn't quite work, but it's good enough for sort of industrial type exposures at the first level. So there's this paper in Journal of the Acoustical Society of America 2004 looking at a large number of chinchillas, so again it's animal data. And what they sort of come up with sort of 3 quite staggering conclusions at the end of it. Below a critical level, there were highly significant log-linear relationships between total energy and the hair cell loss. So there is some relationship between energy and hair cell loss, but it's not at rates predicted by the equal energy hypothesis. So the equal energy hypothesis is a bit of a near miss, but it's okay, possibly good enough for industrial stuff. But when the noise was above a critical level, there was no relation between the total energy and the hair cell loss. So the thing's gone into total freefall, and you're starting to get far more damage than you'd expect. And the other thing which they say, which you should bear in mind again because we're dealing with animal data, and there's some other data, the Kajara and Liebman data, which some people may be aware of, is that the critical level should not be defined purely by immediate physical damage. That's what you see when you're looking under the microscope a few days after the animal's been exposed, because there could be other more subtle losses. I mean, blatting a hair cell is quite a savage way of actually inducing a noise damage. So they're sort of pleading, there may be other things that imply that the critical level is actually lower than just by looking for physical damage. So, moving on to the sort of why am I sort of studying rock musicians and clubbers? These are sort of noise logs. That is, you put a dosimeter, a microphone on near their ear, and you measure over a period of time in minutes, and these are different scales. Some of them are sort of only about an hour in the top one, and here there's about nearly 3 hours, and here there's over 3 hours. You sort of measure the sound level every 10 seconds in about a 1 second average. And what you see, that if you're a performing rock musician in the solid line, the dashed lines are just the peak levels, the sort of the average level you're exposed to is quite phenomenal. It's about 110, 112 dB, that's on stage. If you're muggins in the audience, like me, then in certain places, like some of these slightly wild pubs that we have in Cambridge, you can be up around 110 until the guy decides to turn down the volume for a bit. And then this one was a death metal band that I actually have the log of that. In that death metal band, there's one of my guys logging himself on that, and he was up at around 114, 115 in there. But then when you go to something like a club, the average level is slightly lower, but it's actually a lot longer. So the question of, what sort of damage are you doing to yourself? And these weren't particularly chosen to be, this is hereditary, this is what you get all the time. This is the worst case. This is sort of fairly typical of what you're seeing in a lot of these sort of fairly uncontrolled venues. So you typically see in a club 100 to 105. So the quieter ones are down at 95, but which is sort of more tolerable. But so these are really quite high levels. And what I want to try and show to you today actually is that perhaps there's a link between the critical level that we've expressed in animals, we've got recognised it in animals, and how do you measure the critical level in humans? Because it's a bit unethical to sort of just sort of blow their ears out and then say, oh, that was a bit loud, wasn't it? You've lost your hearing. So what I'm a sort of sub-theme of this is perhaps I think this is some of the first direct evidence that in humans that somewhere around about 100, 105 dB, we're in the range of the critical level in humans. That is when we're moving the damage from, say, the outer hair cells towards the inner hair cells, and that we're getting far more damage than would be predicted just from the sound level alone and the amount of energy exposure. So, and these loggings that we did and the subjects we tested in this have to emphasise that these were voluntary exposures. We gave them warnings before we recruited these people. Said, if you play in a band, would you like to come and work for us? We gave them warnings. We offered them earplugs, and of course, if they started wearing earplugs as they did, that meant that we couldn't test them. It wasn't. But we had to accept that risk that you lost subjects because you were treating them as ethically as possible. But there are still people who want to expose themselves to that sort of level whilst they're performing. Now, another bit of evidence sort of came up in the last lab I worked in from someone called Martina Huss, who was part of a PhD thesis, was looking at dead regions, which is where parts of the cochlea where there's no functioning inner hair cell connection are up to the brain. And so what she did was, these are sort of like audiogram forms. So we've got 4 different subjects in each of the panels. And their absolute threshold is in this cross at the top, this line, solid line at the top of the page. So they're all pretty normal hearing people. And then this solid line at the bottom here is the upper limit to which we could drive the audiometer. So basically she played over an audiometer into each ear, she played a tone at different frequencies. And she got people to rate just how noisy is the tone. So a pure tone should be something really quite pure. But actually some people were saying, actually it sounds like a dirty tone, there's a bit of noise, a bit of fuzz on it. So they sort of rated it slightly higher. And she did this for all the sort of standard audiometric frequencies right up to 12 kilohertz, and did it in 5 dB increments. So if people think it's a pure tone, you should just get a little spot there to say they think it's really quite pure, there's no real distortion from what they perceive in their hearing. And then she did test-retest, and the retest standard deviation is shown by the sort of circle around it, where as you start getting darker and darker, you might be able to notice that somewhere around here there's some sort of shading on there. The people are getting more erratic in their rating of the noisiness of the tone. And so I'm breaking no confidentiality to say that I was subject number 2 on this one. At this stage I was in my early 40s, so I started to get a sort of standard presbycusic, slightly high frequency shift up there. And at the edge of my hearing, you actually start hearing sort of slightly fuzzy tones. They sort of start fizzing in your ears. And that's a similar thing for this slightly younger normal hearing person. But the interesting thing here is these 2 people down here, who are both actually active rock musicians. They have normal stroke, near normal hearing thresholds. They're sort of, the worst is about 20 dB for this person, around about the 3-4 kilohertz region. They have what you might classify clinically as normal hearing. But what you notice is that actually they're a lot messier in their ratings of the noise that they're hearing. That's sort of the sinusoid they're hearing. They're hearing it more as noise. But they're also a lot more erratic than that. And they were actually very good musicians. They were really quite precise in the other things they were doing. And in fact, I ended up using these 2 guys for my experiments. So, we're talking about, perhaps with these guys who have been exposed to high sound levels, that there's a sort of a distortion in the transduction from their cochlea as it heads up to their brain. So what I wanted to do is try to devise a signal where, if you distort it, it turns back into another signal, which we can generate quite easily. So I generated this thing called Gaussian noise, which you should know, sort of sort of the noise you get from a fan. And then there's a sort of very subtle technique where if you just, so noise contains sort of a variety of sinusoids over a range of frequencies. And they're sort of randomly in phase with each other, and you get this sort of quite random spikiness in the output. But via quite a subtle mathematical technique, you can actually shift each sinusoid very gently in time until you actually smooth the overall level of the noise. So it has a very smooth envelope. The idea being is that we're going to stimulate the same point of the cochlea with exactly the same signal, but actually just give it different properties. And those properties, if they're distorted by the cochlea, will turn it from low noise back into what I call Gaussian noise. Okay, and I do actually have here an example of it. So what I've got is 4 seconds of Gaussian noise followed by 4 seconds of low noise, and then it goes back and repeats the Gaussian noise and then repeats the low noise. So if you, it's possibly a bit hard to hear it in here, but just listen to the sort of how does it fluctuate over time? And I'll try and indicate when it's Gaussian and when it's low noise. Okay, so basically the low noise sounds like a warbling tone, slightly noisy warble, whereas the Gaussian noise has sort of got a roughness to it. And if you blow it up into sort of half-second timescales, which is the sort of the timescales of stimuli that I started off presenting them, you see there's a sort of a fluctuation in the Gaussian noise here, and it's quite smooth in the envelope of the low noise. And then if you sort of do sort of histograms of sort of what's the level distribution of these sorts of signals, you see that in red you have your standard Gaussian thing. So as a function of amplitude, the frequency of a current is mostly around about 0 for Gaussian noise, and then it goes up to peaky values. Whereas the low noise tends to be either high plus or high minus, and not spend much time in between. So it tends to have this sort of King's College type effect, where it's like King's College Towers. So just in the time waveform, you've got a very different waveform between the two. And then if you look at the envelope, that is the sort of the short-term average of what's going on here. This one's much more bumpy compared to this one. And you see that the low noise in blue spends its time mostly around about fairly standard level of amplitude, whereas the Gaussian has a much wider distribution. So what we did was we got presented them 3 intervals. And in two of them we presented Gaussian noise, and one of them we presented low noise, and you have to spot the odd one out. And then as you get it correct, we gradually reduce the duration of each of the intervals. So we're measuring what's the shortest time, what length of sound can you actually discriminate from the Gaussian. And now the other thing that we're thinking about is that when you stimulate the cochlea, I mean you should know from sort of excitation patterns if you've done your psychophysics, is that when you stimulate the cochlea, it's very hard to stimulate just one narrow region of the cochlea, because the excitation, although you've got the travelling wave running up the basal membrane, you actually get a small region of the cochlea that's stimulated by sound. So if you use a high-level sound, the range of stimulation is across quite a wide range of frequencies, quite a place along the cochlea. So, which will actually mean that your signal's being transduced through quite a large number of inner hair cells. So the theory that I was working with was thinking, okay, if you want to involve as few inner hair cells as possible, you need to basically present the signal over as little a range of the cochlea as possible. So we start presenting at very low levels relative to the absolute threshold. So you're only stimulating as few inner hair cells as possible. So let's think about what happens when you, if you have disruption, say, to the stereocilia. So here we've got another pretty picture of a healthy animal with its 3 rows of outer hair cells and its 1 row of inner hair cells. And the stereocilia are basically different rows of sort of like they look like a bit like hairs, and they're sort of connected by root sort of ankle sort of tendons, and then there's also these sort of tiny little strings of protein which connect them at high level on there. And it's assumed, well, there's sort of evidence that the transduction mechanism involves the stretching of these links here, these tip links, and the opening of what we call a trapdoor here to allow ionic current flow to flow into them. So the sort of health of the stereocilia is really quite important. So if they're disarrayed, they might be So what normally happens is that as the basal membrane flexes up and down, you see that there's this sort of shearing motion. So here we have the basal membrane with the organ corti here, and in its resting position, the stereocilia is sticking up. If we shift the basal membrane upwards, then you get this sort of like a toothbrush. If you've got a toothbrush, you can do it with a toothbrush. So put your finger on top of a toothbrush and just rub it like that, and you see the hairs bending. So you can end up with the hairs bending one way as the basal membrane goes up, and then as the basal membrane goes down, the hairs go another way. So you're getting this waggling of the hairs, which opens and shuts these trapdoors on the end of the tip links there, and allowing iron current to flow. And the consequence of that is that the neural discharge that happens tends to happen usually in synchrony with the peak of the waveform, at least for up to about 3 to 4 kilohertz, possibly higher than that. And so each cell sort of tends to fire in synchrony with the peak of the waveform, which actually is the negative part of the negative peak. But then you end up with a sort of a cell dynamics in the chemistry, you end up with a sort of refractory period where it doesn't fire. So it's sort of going duh, 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 duh. But if you average this across a sort of group of hair cells, then you're going to get sort of a fairly faithful reproduction of when the peaks in that waveform are. However, if we've got distorted timings of this, what we might have is actually that the firings are actually slightly jittering relative to the waveform peaks. So here, what I've done is I've done a sort of a fairly crude simulation where we start off with our low noise, which has got sort of a fairly low fluctuation in the envelope. And at the other end, we have our Gaussian noise here, which has got a lot of fluctuation in its envelope. And what I basically did was distort the addition of the, just add various versions of that noise at various timescales relative to each other. And as you jitter the adding time, you gradually see that if there's not faithful reproduction of that low noise, it gradually turns into something that approximates Gaussian noise. So that should then be harder to discriminate. So you've got the low noise ultimately will turn into Gaussian noise, and they won't be able to do the task anymore, and that's where you get a threshold. Now, the trouble with this was supposed to be a clinical test, and it was, so it's a great failure because it took about 6 hours to 8 hours to train people to do this task. So forget about that one. We have our failures. It's quite big. Okay, so let's look at sort of typical pattern results. So I said we test people at fairly low levels relative to the absolute threshold. So what I plot here is 10 normal hearing subjects. So you can see in the control group, which is a solid line, left and right ears, that they've got absolute thresholds which are pretty close to 0. And when you do the statistics, there's no difference between them and the exposed group. And so here we're talking about really close to absolute threshold. And so what I do is I measure their absolute threshold, and then I get them to do this discrimination task between the duration of these noises at various levels relative to the absolute threshold, their sensation level. So 10, so actually it's 12, 18, 24, 30, typically. And do it at 3 different frequencies, 2, 3, and 4 kilohertz, which is typically where you start seeing noise damage happening. And also their left and right ears. And what you see generally is that most people can do it at a fairly standard level. So this is the duration of the noise burst that they can discriminate from the Gaussian noise in milliseconds. So some of these people can do a burst as low as about 30 milliseconds, which is really quite a brief hit of what's going on there. And they're reasonably stable across the ears and across level and across frequency. But you see occasional people who just can't do the task at all are down to these low levels, so they're getting worse. So up this scale is actually getting worse. Down the bottom is good performance. And then you see some people like this one. This is a 17-year-old girl who obviously could do the task and understood what the task was, because at 4 kilohertz she performs very well. And then there are some frequencies where she's not quite so good, and others where she goes really off the scale. And then there are other people like that was an 18-year-old lad who could do it really quite neatly. At sort of almost any frequency in any ear. And so you do see some slight degradation in this, because when you get down to 12 dBSL, that's really quite quiet. It's just barely above your absolute threshold. So things like breathing noise can actually interrupt you. So it's quite a difficult task. So, but then what I recruited was 6 people who were in the habit of going to either night clubs or doing rock music, and 2 of them were those people I showed you earlier. And what you see generally here is that as they get to lower levels, they become quite erratic and they actually start getting worse at doing it. And at some level, they just can't do the task at all, like this red and green here, so on there. And when you do the statistics between those 2 groups, what you basically see is that the exposed group are worse than the normal group, generally across 2, 3, 4 kilohertz. Now, I mean, this is in some ways, we say this isn't a very big data set. There's only 6 people there, and trying to get clubbers in. There's a certain mentality. If you're sort of in clubbing, the sort of timekeeping and your commitment to things is slightly different from normal. So it was quite difficult to get these guys in and get a sufficient pool of ones who are motivated. Because the other thing which we asked them to do was to restrict their alcohol and their drug intake, because that's quite often associated. And somebody said to me, Mike, by the time you've given them earplugs, told them not to drink, told them not to have drugs, I think you've missed the point of clubbing. So it was quite difficult to get this data set. So what we see here is just generally there's a sort of seems to be something which appears at low levels in this exposed group. And the question is what? So this is where Brian Moore comes in. He says, well, okay, you've shown that, but what is it? So we then went and got a group of subjects who were hearing impaired with a variety of different losses. So let's start off with a female here who's very young, who's got a familial genetic hearing loss. So we run the same experiment on them. So she's got normal hearing. So we're going to test her. This one actually tests between 2 and 6 kilohertz because she was one of our lab rats and she was quite happy. Well, she wasn't happy by the time they did the experiment. So she's got, a cookie bite type loss here. And what you see here, and this is the colour coding. So basically, red is 2 kilohertz here. So just on the edge, right here, just on the edge of her hearing loss, or what you might conventionally define as a hearing loss, she can actually do the task tolerably well, so 50 milliseconds, which is what some of the other control subjects will do. But when you give her 3 and 4 kilohertz, which is where she has normal thresholds, where you might think, well, everything's okay, the outer hair cells are working fine, she can't do the task. In fact, she actually, I nearly got abused for this one, because she just couldn't do it. You just sit there and you're just bouncing off the top. At 300 milliseconds, you start at 300 milliseconds, and she can't even tell the difference between that and 300 milliseconds. So it's really quite depressing when you can't do that, when you know there should be a difference, and you can't do it. So this person appears to have at least healthy outer hair cells, but is behaving as there's a distortion going on, as if there's possibly an inner hair cell type pathway loss. And the irony is that as you start heading towards, we didn't have a stimuli to test her at 1 kilohertz to see what happened in this hearing loss. So as she became hearing impaired, she was actually getting better. Then we take this lady with a flat loss here, elderly lady, so what we call presbyacusic, no real history of noise exposure. So what we suspect now is this is sort of where the stria vascularis is actually not pumping enough potassium into the middle part of the cochlea, so you don't end up with the sort of the electrode potentials that we need to the electrode potentials to drive the ionic currents. But what you see with this lady, and we did both ears on her because she was such a willing volunteer, is that she's actually remarkably consistent all the way across frequency. So across the level, right down to the low levels. And now in the previous experiment, I only ran down to 12 dB sensation level. But because she's got a flattish 60 dB loss, what you might think is, oh well, she's got recruitment, and therefore any fluctuations in the envelope would be exaggerated. Therefore, that's why she can do the task, is that she's really exaggerating the Gaussian noise odds. So we took her right down to 6 dB SL, which is really, really very low, sort of as low as we could do where we think the cochlea is behaving linearly in both normal hearing and hearing impaired people. And she could still do the task. So it was quite incredible when we got that set. So that implies that there are people with what you might think of as being where the outer hair cell isn't getting enough power to drive it to do its amplification, but that actually the inner hair cell or the transduction is still producing a faithful representation of the signal you put in. And then finally, we have this lady here. Now she's got about a 70 dB loss in a fairly flat part of her audiogram, so we managed to test her there. Now by the time typically if you expect the outer hair cells to go, you'd expect to see a sort of about a flattish 60 dB loss, which is what we see here, or if the outer hair cells aren't getting enough power to do their normal function, you see about a 60 dB loss. So we can see there. But if you've got more than a 60 dB loss, then it's usually you expect to be something wrong in the neural pathway between the cochlea and the brain. Now this lady, although she had no history of industrial exposure, she was actually a schoolgirl in North London in the Second World War. And they actually had an anti-aircraft battery on the school playing fields right next to the school. So when certain aircraft came over and these things set off, they had to go into these underground bunkers where it's only buried in the bank. And she reported it as being deafening. So we strongly suspect she's got some form of damage to her inner hair cells there. And then when you test her, you see that actually she's not particularly good at the task at any frequency, although there's a hint that she can do it at 3 kHz, certainly at some levels, but she's pretty bad over most of the other levels and most of the other frequencies. So it's so this sort of summary sort of gives you the hint that actually people with a hearing loss with functioning outer hair cells, such as here, where you might, they're not necessary to do the task, because here you've got them where the outer hair cells probably are not functioning because it's a sort of presbyopesic loss. But when you start having an inner hair cell involvement, such as here, then you start seeing them unable to do it. And here, where you expect to see them having good outer hair cells, and they can't do it, then you say there must be some other pathway that's failing them. So that was the sort of...
So why do you think you got that pattern on the one with the cookie bite, the red one, the 2000? Why do you think it's good at 2000, closer to the outer, whatever the other damage is?
Well, it would be nice to know. In her family, she had cousins, mother, sister, all had that same pattern, which implies there's something quite strange in the morphology in her cochlea, that actually possibly it's moving towards that, the damage or the sort of dysfunction is moving from the outer hair cells to the inner hair cells at the point of the cookie bite.
So the family all had similar cookie bite and similar findings on your test?
Well, we haven't done that on that particular time.
Okay.
I'd love to do that though. And that family's getting a bit older now. So, and earlier I mentioned about how we're talking about having, it's very hard to get inner hair cell dysfunction without outer hair cell dysfunction, especially with noise type exposures, although in those previous ones you seem to be able to sort of dissociate them at least partly. And so, one of the things that you get when you become hearing impaired, you lose a bit of loss of sensitivity. And when you've got near normal hearing, what you might expect is that your growth of loudness, so you've got sort of loudness that we might think of as being silence, environmental speech, or cinema, as a sort of a fairly realistic range of about 0 to about 100 dB SPL, is that you've lost a bit of sensitivity at the bottom end, but by the time you get up to sort of cinema type levels, you pretty much have the same discomfort threshold. So as normal people, is the one given in blue. So you might call this a sort of a recruitment, the abnormal growth of loudness. And we're testing them down at this sort of level, sort of 10 to 30 dB above their absolute threshold. So if we zoom in on this test region here, we're going to test them relative to their absolute threshold. So you see that if we have a signal that's varying in level between two different levels, its sort of relative output loudness is actually sort of given by this sort of blue line. But if you've got this exaggerated growth of loudness and you put in the same variation in input, the output is going to be slightly larger. So you might expect with an outer hair cell loss that people would notice that change in loudness much better than the person in blue. So they might be more sensitive to fluctuations in the sound than a normal hearing person. So that's what we think of with recruitment. But typically we associate that with more moderate to severe losses. But if this is happening in so when you've got slight shift in the threshold, we expect to see something because the discomfort thresholds don't really shift. So the growth of loudness has to go through the same range. So you'd expect to be a slightly faster growth in loudness. So after the fiasco of the 6 hours training in the previous experiment, we looked at a simpler task, which is actually just to look at amplitude modulation detection. So what you do is you play them as a standard, an unmodulated tone, and then give them a tone that's been modulated, that's got a fluctuation in its envelope. And then what you do is get them to, but if they can spot the difference, and again it's actually this is two alternatives for this one, but if they spot the difference, you gradually reduce the fluctuation until they can't tell the difference. And that becomes their detection threshold, and we can first detect a difference in the fluctuations between that and the unmodulated. And again, we're testing with a modulation rate which is moderately fast, so that, but not so fast that it will spread the energy over the cochlea. So we're trying to look quite locally. And this is partly because there's another paper by somebody called Vinay and Moore where they looked at men in Norway who were using MP3 type players at fairly high levels. And they used this task on that. So, and it's a much simpler task to learn, but it's not a particularly sophisticated task as we've shown. So let's sort of go back to thinking what might we expect to see with this. So here I've got a sort of so if you think about the sort of noise exposure you like to give to a person, ranging from low to moderate, and high, very high, and devastating. And then you might think about their ability to do the task, okay, which could be good, because if you've got recruitment, then you're exaggerating the fluctuations, and then you can detect a small fluctuation, so you might become quite good at the task, or if it's distorted, then you might become quite bad at the task. So if you've got a sort of outer hair cell type loss, is that for low to moderate levels, you wouldn't expect to see any type of outer hair cell. If their noise exposure has been primarily due to low to moderate levels, you're not going to expect to see them having any damage, so you can do the task in this sort of middling function. But then as you get into this sort of the industrial type noise exposure, and you start damaging the outer hair cells, you might expect that they actually get more recruitment because they've lost their sensitivity, and so they actually exaggerate the envelope fluctuations and they get better. Then you go through the critical level around where we think that the damage is transferring and it's becoming non-linear, and then you might have some sort of devastating thing where you end up with, they either can't hear it or they can't, you've got to blow it into them at really high levels and then it's way too loud. So their range, their growth, their ability to say, well, it's fluctuating because it's just popping above threshold, a tiny amount, and then they'll say, so they'll appear good at it, but in fact actually it's bad because they've lost so much of their outer hair cells. So you might expect to see something vaguely like this, and this is very schematic because it's just to make a point. Whereas if you've got inner hair cell dysfunction, where you expect that the signal's going to be distorted as you go into sort of say the critical level, as you lose the damage from the outer hair cells to the inner hair cells, you'd expect them to get bad at the task because you're getting a distorted representation of the envelope. And so therefore, when you're trying to measure them, you've got a slight confusion. As if you combine the two of them, you might have something where actually you don't see much change as you go through it if they've only been exposed to sort of high to just on the edge of this critical level, that you don't see much change. But then when you combine, then goodness knows what happens. So there's a risk that if they've been exposed primarily to low-level noises with the occasional high-level noise, they've got a combination of outer hair cell and inner hair cell, that actually they could come back being apparently normal on this task because they're neither good nor bad. One's compensating against the other. Whereas if it's predominantly really high-level disruption, it's high-level noise exposure and it's disrupted their inner hair cells, then you expect them to be shown being much worse at the task. So there's a risk with this sort of experiment that you're going to end up with possibly a null result because it is such a simple task. So, and this is the new data. So we've got two groups, a young group aged 19 to 24, and average age 21 years, and that becomes quite important later. And then we took another group, 26 to 35 years, average age of 29 years. So there's an average age difference between the two groups of about 8 years. So we're trying to look at how does this progress with time in the short term, because of course we've got other confounds like, well, there's different cultural attitudes towards clubbing and social patterns like that. Do you do longitudinal studies or do you do cross-sectional studies? There's big debate in the literature about that, but it's a sort of, let's just have a first look at this. So they're recruited for the young to have perfectly normal audiograms, 15 dB HL or less, including 3 and 6 kilohertz. So they come in as being normal, both all the groups in that, 32 subjects, and we expanded them to 43 for another reason. And then we ran various things like we did the audiogram, and then we did tympanometry, otoacoustic emissions, and then we did spontaneous otoacoustic emissions. But we only had that equipment for the older group. Now the older group, they've got older, they've got a bit more noise exposure, so they're going to start losing their hearing. So there's a way that you can't exactly match the two groups. That's the real problem. It's a bit of a pain, but we can't do much about that. But the worst we had was this one person had a threshold up around about 30 dB HL. And then we subgrouped within each the young and the older groups according to their self-report on their work and recreational habits. So how much gigging, so how many hours a week did they go? And then we split it up into things like, when you're a student, how often did you go clubbing and gigging? And then once you get beyond 21, in 5-year periods. So that trying to reflect the change in lifestyle that people have as they do these sorts of habits. And also going back before they're 18 and when did you first start going clubbing and gigging? So we could subgroup these people by their self-report, and you have to remember it's a self-report on how much they estimated they've been exposed to these high noise levels. So we have LN, low noise, exposed, infrequent attendees at high noise events, and then HN, high noise exposed, frequent attendees. Now the trouble is that actually by the time you get to the 26 to 35-year-olds, you can't do the classic experiment of having they're either totally exposed or not exposed, because everybody by the time 26 to 35 has some sort of episode of when they've done that. So you actually have to that's where the self-report comes in, because then you can do sort of correlation measures, look at what happens as a function of their self-report. So let's look at this young group, and we split them into our low noise group, which is this threshold here. So this is their absolute threshold at 3, 4 and 6 kilohertz, And this time we've done, for the audiology sonographers, we've done a slightly naughty thing. We've flipped it the other way around so that worst absolute threshold is up the page. But there's a reason for that. And so what you see between these two groups is that there's no shift in absolute threshold of about 3 or 4 kHz, but the high noise exposed group have lost about 5 dB, 5 or 6 dB of absolute threshold, even by age 21 on average. And then when you do the amplitude modulation detection task, where you get them, we did it at 10, 25 and 40 dB above their absolute threshold, you see that, so this is the amplitude modulation threshold, so worse is up the top of that screen and good is down the bottom. And what you see is that the females in the light grey are slightly worse at doing the task than the males. But the females, exposed or not exposed, are doing pretty similarly. But when you look at the males, you see that at the very lowest levels, the males are actually much worse at doing the task. The high noise exposed males are much worse at doing the task than the low noise exposed males. And this would fit in with the fact that males tend to be the people who go to rock gigs, which tend to have slightly higher levels, absolute levels, rather than clubbing, which tends to be more female occupation. And so that would sort of fit, and the previous data set we had was 5 of the 6 noise exposed people were actually rock musicians, and there's just one clubber in there, so that may be, even though they're fairly young, it may be driven mostly by rock music type events. So we see a significant interaction there in this young group. If we look at the older group now, so here we've got AM detection as a function of just the noise exposure, and what you see generally across the groups is that across the group is that the high noise exposed people are much worse at doing the task than the low noise exposed group, but only at this very low level, 10 dBSI. And then it gets slightly muddy here because we then start splitting it into how they do it as a function of frequency. Because remember in the last graph, we had a difference of threshold only at 6 kHz, but not at 3 and 4 kHz. When you look at it by splitting it here, the 6 kHz is the grey, and you see that actually there's no difference between the two groups at 6 kHz. But when you do it by this group here, which is the high noise exposed at 3 and 4 kHz compared to the low noise exposed at 3 and 4 kHz, there's actually a significant difference there. P was 0.16. So we have this, so at 3 and 4 kHz, the noise exposed people are worse at doing the task, but they've got no shift in absolute threshold compared to the normal hearing people, or the low noise exposed. Whereas at 6 kHz, where there is a shift in absolute threshold between the two groups, you're seeing the same pattern of behaviour. So we've got a dissociation between where we see this deficit in performance compared to frequency, compared to their absolute threshold, their audiograms. So we've got a dissociation between the two. And then when we compare the two together, combine the two groups together, just look at the absolute thresholds at 3, 4 and 6 kHz. And again, bad is up the screen. So these plots, what I've basically done is split it by saying what happens with the young and older group in the left-hand panel, and then what happens if we then split it the other way and say what happens if we do it by noise exposure. And what you see is that the older group have got slightly elevated thresholds. It's mostly this one at 3 kHz. So that's their aging process has shifted their absolute threshold to 3 kHz. But when you split it by noise exposure, you see the 6 kHz effect, where there's a shift in absolute threshold, but it's damaging primarily 6 kHz, and the really high levels are damaging 6 kHz, and that's really highly significant. So if we then go into amplitude modulation detection for this same group, you see the similar pattern, that the young group are actually quite good. There's a difference between the young and the older group at doing this task, and the older group are actually slightly better, possibly because they've got shifted thresholds and slightly more recruitment, so they're actually better at doing the task, and that's quite a significant effect there. But then when we do it by noise exposure, here, we see that actually at this very low presentation level, again, the noise exposed people are worse at doing the task than the non-noise exposed people. And I mentioned that there's this problem about how do you get two totally separate groups, and it's really quite hard when you do histograms and noise exposures. So what we do is looking at some correlations. So on this correlation, we're just looking at, as a function of absolute threshold across just the older people, this is their AM detection at 3 and 4 kHz. What we see is that gradually there's a sort of correlation that as their absolute threshold increases, they actually get better at doing the AM task. There, like that, okay, at both 3 and 4 kHz. And it's quite a significant effect. So there's something like a recruitment effect making them get better, which is similar to what we showed in the ANAVAR, the group statistics previously. But the interesting thing, though, is when we get to the older group, is then we do this sort of exposure measure that we do. So how many hours have we been gigging and clubbing over the years, and it's a sort of a summary of their lifetime's exposure. So long exposure is sort of here on this graph here. Okay. And then their AM detection threshold. And actually what you see, and it's not a particularly strong correlation, but you have to remember this is by self-report, which is quite a noisy measure anyway. You actually see a positive correlation. The more that they've been exposed to noise at 3 kilohertz only, then actually the worse they are at doing the task. And you have to remember this is 3 kilohertz where we weren't seeing the shifts in absolute threshold. So again, there's a sort of, so we've got this counter effect here, that as a function of absolute threshold, you're getting the improvement in AM detection, but as a function of noise exposure, you've got a degradation in detection of the AM. So, in summary, repeated exposures to sounds in excess of typically 95 dBA, and we were checking them in terms of what clubs they went to typically, to make sure that they weren't the ones that we'd logged previously and we knew were pretty loud. We see sort of several things here, like degraded processing of modulations, which we think is inner hair cell related, because there's a loss of fidelity in the transduction. We see there's also an improved processing of modulations, which we think is outer hair cell related due to the recruitment, as you see more in the older group with their losses of threshold. There's a hint of dissociation that in the pattern of inner hair cell versus outer hair cell loss across frequency, which is similar to Lieber and Dodd's data in 1984, but sometimes you see damage happening preferentially to one set of cells compared to another set of cells as you go across frequency. And Ian Bruce is the guy who pointed this out to me when I presented this data a couple of years ago. And then the thing that's quite shocking is this is observable in 21-year-old males with a history of beats and club attendance. And so far, we only see it at low sensation levels, that's relative to their absolute thresholds. So therefore, it's a hidden loss, subclinical, and therefore, one might say is actually quite irrelevant. Perhaps I'll leave that to questions as to what the importance of this is. So, what I would suggest here is that this 95 to 100 dBA limit is first real evidence of a critical level in humans, where the damage is moving from outer hair cells to inner hair cells. So finally, I'd like to thank my third-year medics who did most of the data collection, the MRC who funded this in Cambridge, and also Manchester here that's been very good at funding me for preparing this talk, preparing the paper that's gone in, and also funding the open access as well. So I'll put this one in.
Any questions? Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you for a very elegant talk. My question is about screening, because you no doubt know that optoacoustic emissions has been suggested over and over again to screen for any kind of noise damage. Mm. But from what you just told us, you know, it's I'm not so convinced anymore. So yes. What do you think would be a good screening technique?
Well, if the MRC fund me, then in 3 years' time come back with a question. Now, I think we want to look at, in fact, Carolina was helping me with this. We want to run a psychophysical battery, but we also want to look at sort of measuring the ABR, but possibly in some unconventional montages, because we suspect, we can't prove, but it's probably somewhere close to the inner hair cell. So you want to be measuring wave 1, wave 2, so therefore you need a better montage to do that. And Carolina has some preliminary data showing sort of abnormal growth of the ABR waves when you're close to the threshold, because it's not transducing faithfully.
But that would sort of answer the question of what is a good diagnostic test. Mm. But when it comes to screening, then it has to be really cheap and cheerful. So I think that it is really important to also think, you know, what could be done in a very short time, really.
Yeah, and I think that the thing is at the present, when I was first preparing for the first paper, I went, whoopee-doo, they've got a problem at 12 dB SL. If you've got 100 dB dynamic range between normal hearing and discomfort, then to have some problem at the bottom 12 dB is no great chance. So it's because most of the time you're in a masked background, there's always a bit of background noise, so you're not really relying on that level. And it's only when I was writing up and you're starting to deal with hearing impaired people, you realise, well, of course, when you get a moderate to severe hearing loss, your absolute threshold comes up. The discomfort threshold waves around a little bit, but nowhere near as much as it comes up. And so therefore 12 dB, 18 dB SL is actually quite a significant fraction of that range. So therefore one might predict that actually those people would have difficulties actually with a hearing aid because there's unfaithful reproduction in that frequency region, certainly in the 346 kilohertz region. So in the grant proposal it is actually, well, so this sort of hearing loss as defined at present, because we're only seeing it in the bottom 10 to 15 dB SL, it's not really going to bother the normal hearing population. The main problem is what does it mature to when you start to have moderate to severe hearing loss, and therefore then when you start screening it, and it should be easier to detect in a screening type task.
Okay, thanks very much.